It's now my pleasure to introduce Siegel from Maryland University, whose topic is going to be about new trends in our report.
Thank you very much. It's really been a pleasure for me to listen to all the talks today, and in particular, the really superlative talks that have focused on radiology reports. And particularly the incidentaloma report was really interesting, and that tees things up really nicely for what I'd like to talk about. I think in the next dozen years, we're going to see more changes in the way that radiology does reporting than we've had in the last 100 years. And let's talk about that. This is an example of Dr. William Morton's report written in May 1896, just a few months after the discovery of this quote-unquote new form of light that could see through living flesh. And in this particular report, you kind of see something that is a text-based report, and actually, even today, over 100 years later, I'm not sure that reports have changed all that much. The main thing that's happened is that we're doing much more speech recognition, but the way that we report with free text hasn't really changed in a major way. What also hasn't changed is this was an example of the first radiology hedge, where he says, I only got the negative today and could not therefore report earlier. The picture is not so strong as I would like, but it is strong enough to differentiate the parts. This is an example of one of the first structured reports, which was filled out in 1913 on a upper GI barium study. So let's fast forward 105 years and talk a little bit about reporting in 2018. Well, it continues to be relatively inefficient, error-prone, ambiguous. It doesn't really close the communication loop, and we'll talk about some of those issues. And in this era of big data and personalized medicine, we run the risk of becoming a relatively invisible non-participant and commodity if we aren't able to deliver our reports in a machine-intelligible format. We talked a little bit about genomics this morning, and the idea with genomics was that they are objective, we can download the data, and we can have machines do analysis of the genomic data. But as part of the IBM team that actually worked on the Jeopardy software, when we went to the electronic medical record and we tried to discover information in the electronic medical record, the hardest information of all to discover was radiology information and radiology reports. And so as people are creating more and more algorithms to automatically create actions from information in the electronic medical record, our data in radiology remains relatively invisible. So we're on the verge of a major sea change in the way that we practice medicine. We're going to change medicine from an anecdotal form that to one that uses a combination of guidelines, decision support, and safety and quality and performance metrics. But when we do that, our radiology information has to be in a format that can be accessed. So the term personalized medicine has recently been applied to describe the concept of personalizing medical care based on a particular patient. Most people think of genomic data, but actually radiology data is even more complex and arguably even larger and greater than the data in genomics, which is why the term has been coined radiomics. And so our imaging reports in general are pretty much unstructured as it exists today in most cases. And medical images are rarely tagged in a way to make them discoverable. And I think we need to change that. And so in many ways, radiology has become sort of this dark matter, kind of like the dark matter in the universe, which is thought to be 27% of the universe, dark energy 68%. Radiology reports, actually, once they're done and they're read, really are not accessible by all the AI and intelligent systems that are coming into the hospital electronic medical record. So it's kind of interesting. In the US, if I ask my colleagues, why do we keep the medical images? The answer is, well, we have to keep them for medical legal reasons. When I ask my colleagues in surgery or endoscopy, why don't you keep your images? Their answer is for medical legal reasons. It's an interesting irony and different expectation of the radiologist. And so why do we keep our images after we've created the reports? Well, the reason is there's a gold mine of additional data on the images that we can use for comparison purposes, or we can call the images up and look at many other things that are on the images. But how do we make all of that pixel data available as part of big data? And so what we're moving toward is, even though AI is not going to replace radiologists, we're going to see AI ubiquitously. It's going to be everywhere, and we're going to have AI act on our images and analyze the images in every single case that we get. So here's an example of a CT pulmonary angiogram. It was requested in the emergency department, and the angiogram report from the radiologist said essentially the study's negative, no evidence of pulmonary embolism. The question was answered, the radiologist had done her job, and the ER doc was pleased with the report. But if we had a pipeline looking at this particular image and collected data, we would see thousands of data elements. What is the cardiac calcium score? What are the status of bone mineral density, lung nodules, cardiac chamber size, lung texture, cystic changes in the lung volumes, liver size? Is there an atrophic left kidney? And so even though the ER doc wasn't interested in the finding, it may be that the nephrologist is interested in knowing that there's an atrophic left kidney, or it may be that the cardiologist is interested in knowing there's extensive coronary artery calcifications. We wouldn't want to put all this information in a routine report, but we're collecting it all. And to Romain's presentation, what exactly is an incidentaloma in the era in the future when the computer may come up with 1,000 incidentalomas or more on every single case? Is the presence of compression fractures in the spine, is that important? Is the bone mineral density in the spine important? And so whether it's important or not, all of that information will be acquired, cataloged, and then made available to computer systems. And one can also perform automated analysis of image quality. And so timing of the contrast bolus, amount of contrast in selected vessels, field of view, motion artifacts, all of that will be recorded by AI types of software. And where do we store it? We can't put it in the radiology report because nobody wants to read all of that. But the electronic medical record doesn't have the capability of storing it. And other information such as radiation dose and many other types. And so we're moving into an era, whether we want to or not, and I think overall it's probably a good thing, of what's been referred to as synoptic reporting. And Professor Wyland Summer has some slides about synoptic reporting that I just wanted to share to talk about where we're going and what is happening with structured reporting. So as he points out, there are many stakeholders of the radiology report, not just the clinician that we're sharing the images with and that is looking at our study, but also the patient, and also it's the pathologist, and also researchers and public health organizations, cancer registries. All of these folks are consuming the data that we create. So should we continue to think of the radiology report as a static thing, or is it just a presentation state? Is it just a subset of the information that is relevant to a particular person, maybe the referring physician, maybe researchers, maybe public health organizations, maybe a different sense for the patient? So if you take a look at structured reporting, overall, numerous studies have suggested that clinicians prefer structured reports over non-structured reports, and that structured reports, almost by definition, contain a lot more relevant information than non-structured reports on a regular basis. And he makes the distinction between different levels of structured reporting, all the way from level 1, pretty much a free text report, to level 2, one with section headers, to 3 with section and subsection headers, to 4, one that starts to have structured elements, and then 5, one that has structured elements that are set by expert panels, and then number 6, what he refers to as synoptic reporting, which means you have the structured elements, but you actually download the information into a database. And so the sizes of lesions and other observations are made objective and put into a structured database. The American College of Radiology, as you all know, has been doing this for a while. BI-RADS was sort of the grandfather or grandmother of all these taxonomies, but now we have coronary artery disease, thyroid, head injury imaging, prostate imaging, CT colonography, neck, lung, and liver. And this is going to continue to expand. And all of these are starting to make a significant difference in our ability to be able to assess quality and effectiveness for patients and to be able to communicate concisely our findings to patients. But it's a double-edged sword because it doesn't exactly allow the nuances that many of us want to communicate in a much more nuanced and informative fashion. The RSNA, as you know, have created templates in all aspects of radiology and nuclear medicine, which have been downloaded at this point hundreds of thousands or even millions of times. And the American College of Radiology has created something called ACR Assist that takes evidence-based algorithms from the literature, encodes them into a report, and allows one to be able to go in and create an actionable report that takes findings and translates them into expert recommendations and then creates and outputs a report associated with that. There's also, in no doubt in my mind, we're going to be heading in the direction of something that I'd call hybrid reporting, where a radiologist creates a free text report, and at the end of that free text report, then the computer says, I think these are the things that you said. Here's 5 things that I believe that you were trying to communicate, and I'm going to create a bulleted list, and if you agree with these, I'll extract information from your free text and put it into a structured format so that it can be stored in machine intelligible format. This is from some work that we did at the National Cancer Institute, where we looked at taking lesions and, for example, for glioblastoma multiforme brain tumors, categorizing a variety of findings, maybe 20 or 21 findings. And then we created a workstation where the workstation itself guides the radiologist through the findings and asks a series of observations that are specific to a patient with a brain tumor, for example. And so it's the workstation in this case that actually walks you through. When it collects all the data, then there's the possibility of it being able to cross-correlate the data with genomic data. So now it's collected radiomic data based on the MRI characteristics, cross-correlated it with the genomic data, and then it's able to create a patient-specific Kaplan-Meier survival plot, for example, for that patient based on the database. And so overall, I think that we ought to really think hard about taking every study and then having a mechanism where we can label it positive or negative for the indication, positive or negative for incidental findings, what's your level of confidence, what do you think about the quality, and many people are actually asking the referring physicians to rate the examination as well and to get feedback that way too. There's been a lot of interesting work that's been done with natural language processing to mine recommendations, including work that's been done with software that was created at Massachusetts General. And so there are many different dashboards that allow you to be able to search for findings. For example, we have a software that allows us to go through our reports and look for the word recommend or word follow-up. There's also software associated with speech recognition systems that allows you to be able to categorize findings and be able to graphically take a look at how those findings are changing over time. And one of the challenges that I've laid out to a number of folks is there a way to convey information in a radiology history to the radiologist very efficiently? And so could we create something that would allow within 20 seconds for me to understand the entire radiology history of this patient? So here in January 2000, patient has a brain mass and a lung nodule based on the image on the left. Here we have a graphical representation in the middle. The brain mass has decreased in size, the chest nodule remains the same, and in March 2002, brain mass is gone, nodule's the same, and now the patient's developed a myocardial infarction. So here in something where you can look at an image and understand what's in the image almost instantaneously to actually see the history, and then you can click on any one of the findings and get additional detail on it. But being able to present this information in innovative and maybe graphical ways will be really important. Another thing that we're seeing with reporting is that computers are starting to be able to look at your report and extract information. So in this case, it's looking for pneumothorax. If a radiologist finds a pneumothorax, it's able to extract that information in the report and then put it in as a critical finding or at least finding for follow-up. And so you can create rules then that say every time that a certain finding or critical finding is made, a certain thing happens, such as somebody's alerted or something else happens in the department. And as I mentioned, we also have the capability of being able to track dose and automatically embed that in the report as well. So some of the major requirements for this quantitative structured imaging are, number one, we don't want it to decrease productivity. We want to be able to track lesions and findings over time. And one other thing that we're seeing, and Romain talked about this a little bit, was the whole idea of being able to empower patients to see their own reports. And so there's software that's been developed at Duke and at Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania and other places to create a translation of our radiology report into something that is much more patient understandable, translate some of the jargon into something that a patient can understand. And so increasingly in the US, patients are accessing their own radiology reports and images directly through portals in the hospital. And I was part of the RSNA's image sharing initiative where we uploaded images from patients to a cloud account that the patients had established. The same way patients have email now and their calendar in the web or in the cloud, it's likely that patient health information will be up there. The RSNA was really incredibly concerned about patient security and had really long passwords that you had to use for fear that somebody would hack into the system. But when we asked patients, what do you do when you download your images from the internet and you get your images? Well, 1/3 of the patients told us the first thing that they do is they share their images on Facebook, which was interesting. So patients don't seem to be as concerned as we do about security in many cases. One of the biggest challenges, I think, today for radiology reports is closing the communication loop. And so this whole idea that was talked about earlier, whereas in the US, we tend to document that we've called a referring physician about an unexpected or important finding. But what we found is that even when we do that, in a certain percentage of cases, they still don't follow up. So I think next generation reporting systems will not only track the findings, track the communication, but also look for follow-up automatically to see if I found a lung nodule and recommended a CT, was the CT scan actually ordered? And right now, I think we have a lot of things with our reporting systems that are really pretty dumb, actually. Currently, I have to dictate measurements if I make them on the screen. Those measurements should populate automatically into my report. Sometimes the body of the report will say left hip, while the conclusion says right hip. And the software ought to be smart enough to be able to recognize that and find that. I think machine learning is going to help tremendously with some of these challenges, making our speech recognition better, checking about left and right mistakes, and also developing confidence levels. If I say something and the transcription system isn't confident, I want it to be able to underline that because it wasn't sure, the same way a human transcriptionist might ask me. And so what I'd like to do is kind of go into next generation of reporting systems and some of the research we've done, for example, with lung nodule detection. And so we, as part of the National Lung Screening Trial, we downloaded the entire National Lung Screening Trial data with about 27,000 participants into a web-based tool that we created. And then what we ended up doing was we ended up creating a tool that would allow us to dial in the age and the gender and smoking history and nodule characteristics and location. And so what this allowed us to do as we were reporting automatically was to go back and do a real-time search of the entire National Lung Screening Trial database in less than a second, and then come back and report back for patients like you, with nodules like you, of a similar age and a similar appearance, the likelihood that your lesion is malignant or benign is XYZ. Well, actually, what we said was patients like you in our library had this likelihood of having a benign or malignant lesion. And that was presented in the report and to the clinicians. And what we found was that when we did that, it ended up changing the lung RADS category from one category to the other based on the personal information on a patient, their age, their smoking history, and characteristics of the nodules. Then what we ended up doing is looking at the image itself, the pixel data on the nodules, and ended up further refining the estimate of benign versus malignant based on those. Then the next thing that we ended up doing was downloading a data set of 155,000 patients called the PLCO screening trial. It's the prostate, lung cancer, colorectal, and ovarian cancer screening trial. And it followed patients, it's an NIH study, followed 155,000 patients or participants who didn't have cancer over a period of about 15 years. And what it found out, for example, was that if you are a native Pacific Islander, and that's your ethnicity, your likelihood of developing lung cancer in the next 6 years is actually 6 times higher than a Hispanic patient. So if you take a look at Bayesian probability, which we radiologists do whether we're conscious of it or not, the a priori likelihood of a patient developing lung cancer or any type of cancer is something that should be factored in to the probability that a particular lung nodule or a particular finding is benign or malignant. And so now we have this system of being able to take entire clinical trials and create libraries from them that we can embed into our radiology reports and get those answers back almost instantaneously. Now, I may say, well, gee, that's the National Lung Screening Trial, but my patients at the University of Maryland may be a different population. Your patients may be a different population. So instead of just using big national trials like National Lung Screening Trial, it would be great to use your own patients and your own experience, not just for lung nodules, but to be able to create databases to allow systems to personalize the reporting on particular patients. One thing that we've also been looking at is the capability of being able to associate images with reports, so to create multimedia reports. And this is from some work that was done by Les Folio, who's at NIH. He asked the question to oncologists, are radiology reports adequate for oncology assessment? And as you can imagine, the majority of oncologists disagreed or strongly disagreed that they were. They asked, would you prefer tumor measurements, presentation, or how would you like to have your tumor measurement done in radiology reports? A high percentage of them, almost 70%, preferred reports with hyperlinked text to tables and graphs, and what they liked the least, with only a 20% figure, was the standard report text, which they have currently. And so what we're moving toward are multimedia enhanced reports, where we have not only the report, but we also have hyperlinks. And when you click on the hyperlink, it will take you to a graph or a chart or a hyperlink describing a mass or nodule or aneurysm or other finding will actually take you back to the workstation, bring up the image so you can see the image, and then you can manipulate the image from that point. So I think this idea of having these hyperlinks and these workstations and software that allows you to be able to cross-correlate the images with the reports is going to significantly change things, make our reports a lot more friendly, but to this study also increase the agreement between what the oncologists measure and what we radiologists measure. And so with the hyperlinks, the actual use of it by the radiologists increased significantly as radiologists became more used to it. They found that it also had some improvements in efficiency. So just to conclude, for most practices, radiology reports haven't changed much in the last 100 years, but the next dozen years are going to see more changes than we've seen in that 100 years. Structured or synoptic reporting's got many advantages, but it needs to be done in a way that doesn't slow us down. And many vendors and RSNA and ACR have created tools that help in the automatic creation of structured reports, such as hyperlinking and creation of agreed upon templates and classification schemes, such as BIRADS and LUNGRADS and PIRADS, is continuing. Communication tools are not going to only allow us to track the receipt of unexpected and important and critical findings, but the computer software will be able to track whether or not there's actually been appropriate clinical follow-up. And the advent of AI and machine learning and decision support is going to create a mountain of incredibly complex and rich data with every single report. We have to figure out what to do with that. Are those incidental findings? And if so, what do you do when there's 1,000 incidental findings? Where do you store them? And how do you make them actionable? And how will we deal with an era in which that's happening? So the next 10 years are going to be really, or dozen years are going to be really interesting and exciting. And thank you very much for the opportunity to present.